My name Alan Morrison, 49 years old, a self-made construction magnate from Billings, Montana. Hard-working, disciplined, and loyal to a fault, Alan built his company from nothing but grit and long hours. Beneath his calm, rugged exterior lies a man shaped by loss and driven by principle. When his wife's betrayal shatters the world he built, Alan's quiet resolve turns into something far sharper, the determination of a man who refuses to be destroyed by the people he trusted most. I built his life. I deserve his fortune. Those words still echoed like shrapnel in my chest as I sat in the courthouse parking lot, hands clamped so tightly around the steering wheel that my knuckles had gone white. The October air outside was dry and sharp, the kind that burned your lungs when you breathed too fast. I could still hear the judge's gavel, could still see Victoria's face, composed, deliberate, untouched by guilt, as she walked past me without even a glance. 23 years. That's how long she'd been my wife. 23 years of shared mornings, Sunday dinners, late-night talks about the future, now reduced to a list of assets and demands, $14 million in cash and property, half my construction company, and the lake house my grandfather built with his own hands. The truck's engine idled low, humming beneath the weight of everything I couldn't say. Across the lot, Victoria's silver BMW glided out like a polished blade, her lawyer riding shotgun. I wondered if she'd practiced that graceful exit in her head, the elegant escape from the man she'd just gutted in public. She had always been good with words. That was her weapon. Back in college, she was the kind of woman who could make a lie sound like logic, who could make you doubt your own memory. I was 21 then, a broke kid from Billings, Montana, working 3 jobs and barely keeping up with engineering classes. She was a journalism student with an opinion about everything and a confidence that drew people like moths to a flame. When she spoke, you believed her. Hell, I did. Every time. Sitting in that truck, the betrayal didn't feel sharp, it felt cold. Like someone had opened a window inside me and let all the warmth out. I could still see her lawyer standing at the plaintiff's table, listing off my accomplishments like they were crimes. The company I'd built from a rusted pickup and a borrowed toolbox was now just another item on her inventory list. The business that had put roofs over hundreds of workers' heads was being dissected by people who'd never set foot on a construction site. George Brennan, my lawyer and one of the few people I still trusted, had told me this might get ugly. Alan, he'd said, when someone plans a divorce like this, they've already been living in it for a while. You're just catching up. I hadn't believed him. Not then. I thought Victoria was just angry, confused, maybe going through something she didn't know how to explain. I thought we could fix it. But now, sitting there with the courthouse fading in my rearview mirror, I realized George had been right. This wasn't a sudden break. It was a strategy. A dismantling. The signs had been there, scattered like breadcrumbs I was too busy to follow. The way she'd started asking about the company's insurance policies. The new interest in our finances. Her sudden need to organize my desk, which usually meant rummaging through my drawers while pretending to look for stamps. Even then, when I'd caught her doing it, she'd turned it back on me, said I was being paranoid, controlling. God, she was good at that. Making me feel guilty for noticing. I'd spent months trying to convince myself I was imagining it. That marriage goes through rough patches. That stress changes people. But now that everything was out in the open, it all snapped into focus. The phone calls she took in the other room. The lunches she said were with college friends. The new password on her laptop. The way she started asking where I'd be and when. It wasn't curiosity, it was reconnaissance. When you're a builder, you learn to spot structural weakness early. A small crack, left alone, can bring down an entire foundation. I'd built a company on that principle. I should have seen it in my marriage too. My phone buzzed. It was George. You all right? He asked. I stared at Victoria's fading taillights. Define all right. He exhaled softly. She's playing a long game, Alan. The way her lawyer presented today, this wasn't about settlement. It's a takeover. Yeah, I said, my voice flat. I got that impression. We sat in silence for a moment, just the sound of the engine and my heartbeat. Go home, George said finally. We'll regroup tomorrow. But I didn't start the truck. I couldn't. Home wasn't a place anymore, it was evidence. It was a crime scene she'd already picked clean. I thought about the night I caught her in my office 2 weeks ago, rifling through papers. She'd smiled, told me she was looking for stamps. I'd pointed out we kept them in the kitchen. She didn't even blink. Just accused me of keeping secrets, of hiding things. The irony of that moment now burned in my gut. Victoria had always been 2 steps ahead, charming when it suited her, ruthless when it didn't. I used to admire that about her. It made her seem strong, ambitious. But sitting there, staring out at the grey Montana sky, I realized strength wasn't what I'd been seeing all those years. It was calculation. She'd studied me, my habits, my weaknesses. She'd learned how to make herself indispensable, then used that knowledge to dismantle everything we'd built together. The courthouse doors closed behind the last of the lawyers. The parking lot emptied until it was just me, my truck, and that echo in my head. I built his life. I deserve his fortune. I looked down at the manila folder sitting on the passenger seat. Its edges were crisp, its contents heavier than paper should ever feel. Inside were the first pieces of truth, documents, records, and names that would flip this story upside down. Victoria thought today was her victory. But this wasn't the end of my story. It was the start of hers unraveling. I put the truck in gear and pulled out onto the road, the courthouse shrinking in the mirror until it was just a shape on the horizon. The air smelled like dust and rain, the kind of weather that promised change. She had no idea what was waiting for her. Before betrayal had a name, before lawyers and affidavits turned my life into a ledger, there was Victoria. I still remember the first time I saw her, spring of '96, the campus lawn at Montana State. She was sitting cross-legged on the grass with a stack of newspapers beside her, a highlighter in one hand, sunlight tangled in her hair. I was running late for my shift at the hardware store, grease still under my nails from the morning, when I dropped my notebook passing by her. She picked it up before I could, gave me this half-smile that felt like she already knew she was doing me a favor. "You should get a binder," she'd said. "You look like a man who's always trying to hold too much." She wasn't wrong. I was working 3 jobs to pay for engineering school, bartending on weekends, hauling lumber between classes, fixing whatever I could for extra cash. I didn't have time for charm or subtlety. But Victoria, she was both. She had this way of speaking that made every sentence sound like the truth, even when it wasn't. She studied journalism, specialized in persuasive writing and media ethics, a combination that would later feel like cosmic irony. Her professors adored her. So did everyone else. She was magnetic, the kind of woman who could make you forget the world had rules. Our first date wasn't anything cinematic. We grabbed coffee at a place near campus that smelled like burnt beans and ambition. She asked about my family, my plans, my hometown. When I told her I was from Billings and that my dad was a carpenter, her eyes lit up. "So you build things," she'd said. "That's rare. Most people our age just talk about what they want. You actually make it." I didn't realize then that she was studying me, learning how to speak my language, how to make me feel understood. That was Victoria's gift. She didn't just listen, she mirrored. After graduation, I took a job with a construction firm out in Missoula. The pay was terrible, the hours worse, but it was a start. She got a position as a local news writer, mostly human interest fluff, community fairs, small business stories. She'd interview struggling entrepreneurs, turn their hardship into inspiration, then come home and tell me, "You should be one of those stories." When I decided to start my own company, Morrison Construction, it was Victoria who helped me file the paperwork. She typed the proposal letters, made the logo, even took photos for our first brochure. She called herself the silent partner, joked that she was my PR department before we could afford one. Back then, I thought we were a team. I'd come home covered in sawdust, and she'd be waiting with coffee, talking about her day like we were building something together. It was simple, honest. At least it seemed that way. We got married the year the business finally broke even. Small ceremony in her parents' backyard in Bozeman. Her father, a banker, didn't think much of me. Too rough around the edges. Her mother, polite but distant, told me I had potential in that careful tone people use when they mean not enough. But Victoria, she believed in me. Or at least, she said she did. And for a long time, that was enough. Those early years were hard. There were nights we couldn't afford heat, mornings when I'd wake up before dawn to chase unpaid invoices. She'd leave sticky notes on my lunchbox with words like "you've got this," or "for us." That word, us, kept me moving. It made the exhaustion feel noble. When the first big break came, a contract to renovate a hospital wing, she threw a dinner party. We didn't even have real wine glasses then. She used mason jars and said it was rustic charm. I didn't see it then, but she wasn't celebrating me. She was rehearsing us. The power couple. The success story. As the years rolled on, Morrison Construction grew. New trucks, new offices, new hires. My name started to mean something in Billings. People shook my hand differently, firmer, more respectful. But something in Victoria changed along with it. She stopped writing. Said journalism didn't pay enough. Started focusing on managing our home. But that home became more like a portfolio. Every furniture piece, every trip, every social event calculated to project status. She'd tell people, "Alan built the company, but I built the image." At first, I laughed it off. But the more she said it, the more it sounded like a warning. Sometimes at night, I'd catch her looking at me like she was watching a stock she'd invested in, evaluating returns, calculating value. Her affection felt like interest payments, and I was the account that needed to keep producing. Still, I told myself that was marriage. You evolve. You adapt. You survive. There was one night, maybe 12 years in, when I came home late from a site inspection. She was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 glasses of wine, staring at a stack of unpaid property tax forms. I told her not to worry, that the next project would cover it easily. She didn't argue. Just looked up at me and said, "You'll make it work. You always do." I thought it was faith. Now I know it was expectation. It's strange, looking back. The warning signs weren't hidden. They were in every conversation, every glance, every silence that stretched too long. But when you love someone, you rewrite the truth until it fits the version you can live with. If you told me then that the woman who toasted to our first contract would one day try to dismantle everything I'd built, I'd have called you crazy. But the truth is, the betrayal didn't start in the courthouse. It started right there, on that campus lawn, when a woman with sunlight in her hair told me I was a man who carried too much. And made sure she'd be the one holding it next. By the time Morrison Construction turned 15, we weren't a company anymore, we were an institution. 60 employees. For major contracts with the state. A reputation for quality and reliability that took years of sweat, risk, and sleepless nights to build. But behind every hand I shook and every deal I signed, Victoria's shadow was there, curated, composed, and camera-ready. She'd learned how to turn my work into her reflection. If a local magazine ran a feature on Billings power couples, she'd arrange the interview. If a charity wanted a sponsor, she'd make sure our names were printed side by side. She knew the right people to impress, the right events to attend, and the right stories to tell. But the problem with building an empire beside someone like her is that, eventually, you realize she's not standing next to you. She's standing on top of you. I started noticing it around year 17. At the company holiday party, one of our new investors, a slick kid from Bozeman in an imported suit, kept calling Victoria the brains of the operation. Everyone laughed, including her. She didn't correct him. Just tilted her head, sipped her wine, and said, "Oh, Alan handles the heavy lifting. I just keep things running smoothly." That line got applause. And in that applause, I heard something shift. After that night, the investor meetings changed tone. I'd walk in expecting to discuss blueprints and logistics, only to find Victoria already there, charming her way through strategy sessions she had no business attending. She'd call it networking. I called it infiltration. She started spending more time downtown, meeting with people I didn't know. Developers, consultants, potential partners. Whenever I asked who they were, she'd smile and say, "Relax, Alan. You should be grateful your wife's this involved." But gratitude was the last thing I felt. Because every time she got involved, something I'd built on trust started to wobble. Then came him. His name was Evan Keller, 41. Harvard MBA. A consultant who'd just moved to Billings to advise high-growth firms. Clean-cut, articulate, the kind of man who called everyone buddy and meant it until he didn't. Victoria met him at some networking event, said he was helping her modernize our operations. I didn't question it at first. We were expanding fast, and efficiency mattered. But the first time I saw them together, something in me twisted. It wasn't the way she looked at him, it was the way she didn't look at me. Evan started showing up at the office more often. At first, it was just to observe, but soon he was suggesting changes, new software systems, new accounting procedures, new ways to protect our assets. Every idea came out sounding smart, efficient, forward-thinking. But underneath the jargon, I could feel it. He was quietly dismantling my control. One afternoon, I walked into my office to find him sitting behind my desk, Victoria perched on the corner, both laughing at something on my computer screen. I froze in the doorway. Something funny. Evan didn't even look embarrassed. Just showing Victoria the new budgeting model. You'll love it, Alan. Simplifies the entire expense chain. I looked at the monitor. He was logged into our internal accounts. Access I hadn't granted. My voice came out steady, but low. How'd you get that password? He smiled. Victoria had it. And there it was. The first crack I couldn't ignore. That night, I brought it up. Calmly, at first. She called me paranoid again, said I was too protective of the company. He's just helping, she insisted. You're always complaining about how much work you have. Now someone's lightening the load. But it didn't feel like lightening. It felt like loosening, one nail at a time, until the whole structure would eventually collapse. Over the next few months, things got strange. Payroll accounts were accidentally rerouted. Vendor payments delayed. Even my emails started going missing. Every time I brought up discrepancies, Victoria had an explanation. Always smooth, always rehearsed. Then, one evening, my foreman, Rick, showed up at my house with a folder in his hands. You should see this, he said, closing the door behind him. Didn't feel right keeping it quiet. Inside were invoices, contracts signed under Morrison Construction but redirected to a different account. One I didn't recognize. The signature. Mine. Only it wasn't. It was forged. And at the bottom of the paperwork, listed as liaison between our company and the client, was one name. Victoria Morrison. For a long minute, all I could do was stare at the ink. My signature. My logo. My wife's handwriting. Rick cleared his throat. You think she's in on it? I wanted to say no. I wanted to believe there was some mistake. But denial is a luxury you lose when your life starts falling apart on official letterhead. The next morning, I went through her home office while she was out. She'd always kept it neat, organized, almost sterile. But I found what I needed tucked inside a folder labeled consulting expenses. Bank transfers. Payments. Emails between her and Evan Keller. They weren't just consulting. They were selling off parts of my company, piece by piece, to a shell firm registered under Evan's cousin's name. I remember sitting there, surrounded by papers, the walls closing in, the air electric with rage. That's when I saw it, the email that started it all. Subject line. I built his life. I deserve his fortune. It wasn't addressed to Evan. It was from her. To her attorney. And in that moment, everything went quiet. The noise in my head. The explanations. The doubts. Because that's when I finally understood. She hadn't just betrayed me. She'd been building my destruction like it was one of my projects. Blueprint by blueprint. Phase by phase. And I had funded every nail of it. The first thing I learned about building was this: if you want to tear something down, don't swing a hammer. Study the foundation. Wait for the right load-bearing point. Then take it apart, quietly, piece by piece. That's how I decided to handle Victoria. Rage would have been easy. God knows I wanted to drive straight to her office, throw the evidence on the desk, and watch her face crack. But men who act on emotion lose everything. Builders don't demolish, they plan. So I planned. For 3 days, I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk, surrounded by the proof of her betrayal, bank transfers, fake invoices, contracts I'd never seen but had signed. Every paper cut from those pages felt like a reminder of how much I'd missed, how much she'd stolen while smiling over morning coffee. George Brennan, my lawyer, came by on the 4th day. He took one look at the table and said, "Jesus, Alan. You sitting on a time bomb?" "More like a blueprint," I told him. He skimmed the documents, whistling low. "If half of this is legit, she and Keller are toast. You want me to go to the DA?" I shook my head. "Not yet." He frowned. "You've got evidence of fraud, maybe embezzlement. What are you waiting for?" "Timing," I said. "She spent years making me look like a fool. I'm not giving her the satisfaction of thinking I just reacted. I want her to wonder when the floor starts to crack." George leaned back, crossing his arms. "You're playing a dangerous game, Alan. You push too slow, she might hide the rest of the money." "That's why I'm not pushing slow," I said, picking up one of the forged contracts. "I'm pushing smart." I started by pretending nothing had changed. At home, I acted tired, distracted, beaten by the court ruling. She mistook my silence for surrender, her favorite kind of victory. She'd walk into the kitchen in the mornings wearing that smug calmness, the kind that said, "I've already won." "You should take a break from work," she'd tell me, buttering toast like she hadn't gutted my life. "You're no good to anyone if you burn out." I'd smile faintly. "You're probably right." Every word out of my mouth was bait. Every nod, a calculated lullaby to her paranoia. Meanwhile, I started digging. I went through company archives, tracing every document she'd signed on my behalf. Turns out, Victoria had created a shell company 6 months before filing for divorce, VM Strategic Holdings. It didn't build anything, didn't sell anything. Its only purpose was to receive things. Money, contracts, assets. The kind of quiet pipeline you set up when you're planning a future without the person funding it. Through another contact, Rick's cousin, a retired accountant, I learned that VM Strategic was tied to a trust in Delaware. Anonymous. Untraceable. The kind of setup rich people use to disappear money overseas. But the key to the whole thing was the founder's signature. Victoria Morrison. And, interestingly, her attorney's paralegal was listed as the trustee. That was a rookie mistake. See, lawyers are careful. They don't leave fingerprints. But their staff? That's where things slip. I didn't go to the police. I didn't go to the press. I went to someone who actually understood leverage, Harold Denton, a private investigator I'd hired years back when one of my site foremen was caught skimming materials. The man was old school, retired detective, chain smoker, still carried a flip phone. When I showed him the files, he gave a low chuckle. "Hell, son. This is cleaner than most divorce settlements I've seen. Lady planned this like a military op." "That's why I need you," I said. "She's good. Too good." He flipped through the papers again. "You want her caught?" "No," I said. "I want her cornered." He raised an eyebrow. "Difference." "Caught ends the game," I said. "Cornered makes her panic. People make mistakes when they're scared." While Harold went to work, I started rebuilding my narrative. Quietly. I met with my board, told them I'd be restructuring operations after the divorce. Brought Rick into the fold, promoted him to acting operations head. I needed people I could trust, people who didn't owe Victoria favors. Then I went digital. The company's financial systems had all been upgraded under Evan Keller's supervision. I hired a cybersecurity consultant, young kid, 22, barely out of college but sharp as hell. Within a week, he'd uncovered a hidden access portal tied to Evan's credentials. It wasn't just monitoring the company, it was extracting data. Blueprints. Bids. Client lists. Victoria hadn't just wanted half my fortune, she wanted to own the company outright. Evan's consulting firm had already registered a new entity under a suspiciously familiar name, Keller and Morrison Development Group. That was the moment the plan fully formed in my head. They thought they'd buried me. But I was already digging underneath them. Harold's report came in a week later. He'd followed Victoria and Evan for days. Dinners. Hotel meetings. Offshore wire transfers. Everything was neatly documented. At the bottom of his file was a photograph, Evan and Victoria sitting in the back of a black car outside the bank, her hand resting on his leg. Her face tilted toward him, smiling like she hadn't just burned her life to the ground. "That enough for your blueprint?" Harold asked, handing me the envelope. I looked down at the picture and nodded. "More than enough." He gave a knowing smirk. "So what's the next step?" I exhaled slowly, folding the photo into my jacket pocket. "The next step," I said, "is to let her think she's safe. Then I'll take back what's mine." "Legally?" he asked. I smiled, thin, deliberate. "Legally enough." That night, Victoria came home late. She smelled like the perfume she wore when she wanted to feel powerful. She poured herself a glass of wine and leaned against the counter. "Long day?" she asked, casual. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice calm. "Just tying up loose ends." She smiled, satisfied, and turned away. And as I watched her walk upstairs, confident, untouchable, I realized something chillingly simple. I didn't love her anymore. But I understood her. And that was far more dangerous. Because she built her betrayal like a blueprint. But I build for a living. And I know exactly how to make something collapse. Without anyone seeing the first crack. The one in your head and the one that tells you what you need to hear. George Brennan had been both to me for years, part attorney, part confessor, part reluctant family counselor. He knew the business the way I did, every subcontractor, every lean month, every client who promised the moon and paid later. He also knew Victoria in ways most people didn't, socially, clinically, the way a lawyer knows a case by its seams. When he walked into my kitchen that afternoon, the house still smelled faintly of her perfume, lavender with a clinical edge, the scent she wore when she wanted to look serious. He took one look at the strewn documents and bank statements and sat down like the weight of them had landed on his knees. "Jesus," he said, flipping through a forged invoice as if it were an obscene joke. "She went full opera." I let out a laugh that had no humor in it. "She went full war." George rubbed his face. "I should have seen it, Alan. I'm sorry." His voice was professional, but the apology was personal. He'd known us both, he'd watched us at Christmas dinners, seen us at the office holiday party. He'd never expected the betrayal to come from that direction. Family was supposed to be a different category. "You warned me it might be ugly," I replied. "You said people plan. You said." "I said a lot of things," George interrupted gently. "But that doesn't change what's in front of us." He folded his hands and fixed me with the kind of steady stare that had closed more contracts than he'd ever celebrated. "Listen to me very carefully. There are two ways to handle this. One is to go scorched earth right now, criminal referrals, press, public exposure. The other is surgical. The latter gives you control." Control had two meanings in our conversation. The spreadsheets and contracts George knew like gospel, and the fear roiling my gut. I'd fantasized about public humiliation, about watching her name dragged through every gutter in Billings. But George was right. Scorched earth might feel righteous, but it would also burn me. Businesses die from scandal. Reputations crumble even when you're innocent. I had workers depending on me. Families whose provider was the company I'd built. I couldn't trade my employees' livelihoods for the pleasure of seeing Victoria pay. "So we do surgical," I said. The plan had already been forming in my head for days, but saying it out loud made it real. "We corner her. We don't give her the satisfaction of seeing us panic." George studied me. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure I don't want to be a man who reacts," I said. "I want to be a man who thinks 3 steps ahead. You once told me a deposition is more like a chess game than a shouting match. We're playing chess." He smiled, a brittle curve. "God help me, your metaphors are getting construction adjacent." He tapped a few pages with a pen. "First, this restraining order she filed? It's malarkey. She's trying to isolate you. You need to document everything, every call, every cancelled meeting, every client who hesitates. If she's trying to make you look unstable, you build counter-evidence." I'd already started that. In the days since the decree, I'd been obsessive. Screenshots of texts, timestamps on meetings, an archive of the company's emails. I'd set permissions on accounts, locked down financials, and had Harold, my PI, shadow her movements. My life had evolved into a ledger of proof. George continued. Second, you let her think she's in the driver's seat. It's a trap. Give her the illusion of victory, but make sure legally the assets she's being awarded are entangled in things she can't touch. You've done some structuring before, we'll use that. But we have to be meticulous. If she can show a judge that she's been shortchanged, she'll have standing to attack the trust. That's why we need the trust language airtight, I said. The lake house was transferred on purpose. Saying it aloud felt like confessing a strategy aloud, and for the first time, a small ember of satisfaction lit. Protecting that land had always been important, now it felt like defending something sacred. George folded his hands and leaned closer. Third, Kyle Brennan. His voice dropped the way people's do when they say something that might break a family. Kyle, George's younger brother, was my partner, a man I'd trusted like blood. If Patricia's evidence is solid, Kyle's breach of fiduciary duty gives us a legal lever. That morality clause in his partnership agreement? We can enforce it. If he's been sharing confidential info, he's given you grounds to force a buyout. I want that clause enforced, I said without hesitation. The betrayal from a business partner cut deeper than any marital wound. A partner was supposed to be someone who watched your back. Kyle hadn't just watched his chance, he'd helped hand it to her. And finally, George said, softer now, you have to prepare for public fallout. People will take sides. Friends will choose. The banker who's been friendly for years, he might ask questions. The community will gossip. You need a plan for that too. He handed me a small stack of papers, a crisis communication template, a list of trusted vendors, contact numbers for accountants who could do emergency valuations. He'd thought of everything. It was both comforting and suffocating to see how neatly war could be catalogued. Steps, counter-steps, contingencies. We talked strategy for hours. How to present the trust documents so they read cleanly in court. How to document Kyle's communications without looking vindictive. How to make Victoria's offshore structures visible without tipping her off. George warned me against moralizing in public. Our job was to be credible, not vengeful. There was a craft to winning in a courtroom. Patience, precision, appearance of generosity. At one point, we paused and George looked at me like he had when I'd first started Morrison Construction and told him I wanted to bid for the county hospital. You know what this'll cost you, don't you? He asked. Not in dollars, emotionally. You'll have to watch people you love hurt. You'll have to make decisions that look cold. Are you ready for that? I thought of the lakehouse dock and the way the water used to lull me into a calm I hadn't felt since my parents died. I thought of a younger version of myself who would have run screaming from the fight. I thought of every foreman and employee who'd trusted me with their paychecks. I said. Because revenge, in my mind, wasn't about pleasure. It was about restoration. Not of pride, but of order. If Victoria wanted to treat marriage like a contract she could exploit, I'd respond with a contract of my own, one written in the language she respected, law. We left the kitchen that evening with a ledger of next steps and a thin, practical piece. Plans don't end grief, they shape it. For the first time since the courthouse, the rage in my chest shifted. It was still there, hot and jagged, but it had a purpose now. We were no longer merely victims in a story Victoria had written. We were players in a different kind of game, one that required patience, evidence, and the unglamorous work of building a case the way I'd built a business, piece by piece, with precision. George stood and put a hand on my shoulder. We do this right, Alan. Not to humiliate, but to protect what's yours. I nodded. Outside, the sky over Billings had the washed grey look of a late afternoon, the kind that promised rain. Inside, the lights over the kitchen hummed steady. It all felt eerily ordinary, like the calm before a storm that only the people who'd planned it could see coming. The call came 2 days later, right as dusk slid over the Montana plains. Patricia Hayes had the kind of voice that carried both authority and fatigue, the sound of someone who'd seen too much of what people do to each other. A retired detective turned private investigator, she'd spent 25 years in the Billings Police Department chasing white-collar fraud before she decided she'd rather get paid to stop it. Mr. Morrison, she said, skipping pleasantries. I think you're going to want to sit down for this. Her tone wasn't dramatic, it was surgical, which somehow made it worse. I met her the next morning at her office, a converted mechanic's garage on the edge of town. The walls were lined with file cabinets and corkboards crammed with photographs, receipts, and scribbled notes. On one corner of her desk sat a half-empty thermos of black coffee that looked like it had been refilled too many times. She got right to it. "Your wife's been planning this a lot longer than you thought." "How long?" I asked. 18 months, give or take." The words landed like a hammer. I'd suspected 8. Maybe 10. But a year and a half meant she'd started plotting before my parents' funerals, while I was still standing by my father's casket promising I'd keep the family land safe. Patricia slid a file across the desk. Inside were records, copies of emails, bank statements, and appointment logs. She tapped one page with a blunt fingertip. "She consulted with 3 different divorce attorneys," Patricia said. 2 private investigators. 1 forensic accountant who specializes in business valuations. Everything about your company, contracts, holdings, projected income, she's been documenting since the day you filed your parents' estate paperwork." I stared at the evidence. Typed words, dates, signatures, the debris of betrayal. She waited until the lake house was transferred into my name. Patricia nodded. "Until everything you'd inherited became legally yours. Then she started the clock." The air in that office felt too thick to breathe. Every memory from the past 2 years flickered in my mind like a slideshow, the coldness in her eyes at dinner, the sudden push for insurance updates, the questions about cash flow that I'd mistaken for curiosity. Patricia continued, her voice level. "She's been recording your conversations. Every argument, every business discussion, even casual phone calls. Hundreds of hours of audio. Recording." I repeated, numb. "In Montana, only one party needs to consent," she said. "Since she was part of the calls, they're admissible." It was like finding out every intimate moment of my life had been turned into evidence. She'd turned our marriage into a surveillance project, our kitchen into a wiretap. "She's building a profile," Patricia explained. "The recordings make you sound controlling, financially manipulative. She's framing the narrative, the wife who sacrificed her career, trapped by her husband's dominance." That word, narrative, hit a nerve. Victoria had always been a storyteller. She'd studied journalism, learned how to make truth bend around the edges of emotion. She could make you feel sympathy for the devil if she had enough time and a microphone. "She's good with stories," I muttered. Patricia arched an eyebrow. "She's not the first. People like your wife don't just want money, they want the story that justifies taking it. It's easier to destroy a man if you can convince the world he deserved it." Silence stretched between us. Outside, a semi rolled by, rattling the windows. Then Patricia added, almost gently, "But she made mistakes." I looked up. "She's gotten careless," Patricia said. "Her phone logs show calls to someone inside your business, long ones, regular ones. Texts too. She's getting inside information, but not from an accountant or attorney." She turned a page in the file and slid a photograph toward me. The picture showed Victoria sitting at a small restaurant table. Across from her, unmistakable even in grainy resolution, was Kyle Brennan, Georgia's brother. "My business partner." The caption under the timestamp read, April 7th. 8:23 p.m. 2-hour meeting. I stared at the photo so long the world blurred around it. My mind scrambled to make sense of it, maybe a coincidence, maybe something innocent. But Patricia kept talking. "This wasn't a one-time thing," she said. "I've got 12 separate meetings documented over the past 6 months. Same pattern. They meet outside Billings, small places, never the same one twice. She's been asking him about company finances, cash flow, equipment valuations, project bids. Everything she'd need to prepare her case." "She's using him," I said, the words grinding out of my throat. Patricia hesitated. "She's not just using him." I felt my stomach drop. "I found evidence of personal contact going back 14 months, she said. "Text messages. Hotel receipts. Private dinners." She flipped open another folder, showing me printouts, time-stamped messages, partial photos, even a hotel bill charged to Kyle's company card. "Your wife's been having an affair with your partner." The world seemed to tilt sideways. I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself. 14 months. I whispered. At least, she said. Started right after your mother passed. The timing isn't accidental, Mr. Morrison. You were grieving. Distracted. That's when she started moving money between accounts and building her narrative. She needed someone who knew your business from the inside. I felt something cold and ancient crawl up my spine. Betrayal is a physical thing when it hits you, not a metaphor. It lives in your body. Patricia pushed one final photo forward. Victoria and Kyle in a parking lot, standing too close, her hand brushing his chest. No mistaking what that was. I'm sorry, she said. I nodded numbly. I wasn't angry yet, not fully. It was worse than that. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left only the echo. When I spoke, my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Are you sure? She nodded once. 100%. I sat there in silence, the weight of 18 months pressing down. My wife, and my partner had been dismantling my life piece by piece, planning to rebuild something new on the ruins. Patricia closed the folder and leaned back. I think they're planning to start a company together once the divorce is finalized. Her interior design business. He's listed as the architect on her proposed LLC filing. I checked with the Secretary of State's office. Of course. It fit perfectly. She'd get her settlement, the money, the assets, the Morrison name, and then build a rival firm with the man who'd helped destroy mine. I looked at the photo again. Her smile was small, almost proud. Kyle looked at her the way I used to, before I realized she smiled like that right before a kill. Patricia said quietly, "You've been set up, Mr. Morrison. But setups have patterns. Once you know the pattern, you can dismantle it." I closed the file, my hand steady now. Then that's what we'll do. Because if Victoria wanted a story, I'd give her one. But it wouldn't be the one she wrote. It would be the story of how she built her betrayal brick by brick, and how I used every one of those bricks to build her downfall. Outside, the wind picked up. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled across the plains like a promise. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of anger. Anger was sharp, fleeting. This was something slower, colder. It hummed beneath my ribs like a machine starting to run on its own fuel. Every betrayal has a pattern, Patricia said. And patterns can be dismantled. So I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, spreading the evidence across the wood like a blueprint. Emails. Receipts. Photos. Every thread of deceit laid out in neat, surgical order. For 23 years, I'd built houses, measured twice, cut once, every line precise. And now, staring at the debris of my marriage, I realized, betrayal had its own architecture. Victoria had drafted hers like a project proposal. Phase 1, emotional exit. The gradual withdrawal. The distant touches. The late nights explained by networking. I'd mistaken her fading affection for stress. In hindsight, it was demolition. Phase 2, structural weakening. The financial questions. Why don't we simplify the accounts? Shouldn't we put more in my name for tax reasons? She'd been prying out the load-bearing beams one at a time. Phase 3, reconstruction. Enter Kyle. He'd been her scaffolding, steady, available, weak enough to be molded. My trust in him was the foundation she built her scheme on. And I'd let her. By the time the sun came up, I had a plan. Not revenge. Not yet. A response. I called George first. He answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly with sleep. "Alan." "I have proof," I said. "It's Kyle. He's been feeding her information, and more." A pause. Then a sigh. "Jesus Christ." "I'm sending you everything Patricia found," I said. "And we're moving fast. I want the partnership dissolved. I want every communication locked down. And I want to know exactly how deep his access went." George's voice hardened. "You're sure you want to go this route? This won't be quiet." "I don't care about quiet anymore," I said. "I care about truth." By mid-morning, George was at my house. He looked older than he had 2 days ago, the kind of tired that comes from realizing family loyalty and justice are no longer compatible. He flipped through the files in silence. When he got to the photos of Victoria and Kyle, he didn't react. Just nodded once, like a surgeon confirming a diagnosis he already suspected. "We'll handle this in 2 stages, he said finally. "First, the corporate angle. We'll call a partner meeting, confidential, limited attendance. We'll confront Kyle with the evidence in a controlled environment, on record. If he admits breach of fiduciary duty, we can trigger his forced buyout clause. And if he doesn't, then we give him the impression that law enforcement already knows," George said flatly. "It's bluff, but it'll make him sweat. Men like Kyle don't survive pressure, they crumble when their image cracks. And Victoria. Patricia keeps digging. If there's money movement offshore, we'll trace it. We'll catch her in her own design." He gathered the papers into a single stack, clipped them neatly. Then he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since my father's funeral, somewhere between pity and respect. "You're handling this better than I expected." "I'm not handling it," I said. "I'm managing it. Like a project." That earned the faintest smile. "Then let's build your defense like a house. Strong footing. No shortcuts." The partner meeting took place 3 days later at the downtown office. Conference room C, neutral ground, glass walls, blinds drawn. Kyle sat across from me in his navy blazer, the one he wore when he wanted to look respectable. He smiled when I walked in. I didn't. George led the discussion. Calm. Methodical. He opened with business updates, financial health, upcoming bids, standard meeting talk. Then, mid-sentence, he slid a folder across the table. "Before we move to projections," George said, "we need to address a compliance matter." Kyle's smile faltered. "Compliance?" George leaned back. "Yes. There's been an internal review of confidential information, client bids, cost estimates, vendor agreements. Some of that information has surfaced outside the company. We need to confirm whether your communications have been secure." Kyle blinked. "Of course they have. What are you suggesting?" I said nothing. Just watched. George flipped open the folder. Inside, a printout of one of Patricia's photos, Kyle and Victoria in that same restaurant booth. He didn't even try to hide his reaction. His eyes darted up, then down again. His face drained. "What is this?" he said weakly. "That," George replied, "is evidence of multiple private meetings between you and Mrs. Morrison over the last 6 months. Meetings where, according to corroborated phone records, company data was discussed." Kyle's jaw tightened. "You're out of line." George didn't blink. "Alan has reason to believe you've breached fiduciary duty. If that's true, the partnership agreement allows immediate dissolution pending investigation. We're giving you one chance to clarify your position, here, on record." The room went dead quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the HVAC. Finally, Kyle looked at me. "You really think I'd betray you?" I held his gaze. "I don't think. I know." Something cracked in his expression then, not guilt, exactly, but fear. The kind of fear that comes from realizing you've underestimated the man you tried to outmaneuver. He tried to stammer a defense, something about just talking, keeping peace, helping her navigate the transition. George let him talk. Every lie recorded. Every contradiction documented. When he finally stopped, George leaned forward. "We'll have your keys, your company laptop, and your client list by end of day. You'll receive a letter from our auditors within the week." And just like that, Kyle Brennan was out. He stood, fists clenched, eyes darting between us. "You're making a mistake, Alan. She's not who you think she is." I almost laughed. The irony of it. "Neither are you," I said. He left without another word. That night, George called with an update. "He's already contacted Victoria," he said. "She's nervous. Patricia caught her on a call asking about damage control. Whatever they planned, it's unraveling." I sat on the back porch of the lake house, the autumn wind rolling cold off the water. For the first time in months, I didn't feel trapped. I felt steady. Victoria had built her betrayal like a house of mirrors, carefully angled, beautifully deceptive. But mirrors, when hit with enough force, don't bend. They break. And I'd only just begun swinging. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels poised. That's what the lake house felt like that night, not peaceful, but waiting. The kind of silence that comes right before a storm decides where to strike. George called early the next morning. She's panicking, he said without greeting. Patricia's been monitoring her communications. Victoria's reaching out to every mutual contact she can find, lawyers, bankers, even that journalist from the Gazette. Of course. Control the story, control the outcome. It was her oldest trick. If she couldn't win in court, she'd win in perception. She's going to claim emotional abuse, George continued. She's floating it in her circles already, saying she felt trapped, manipulated, that you cut her off financially before the divorce. She's rewriting the script, I said. That's what she does best, he replied. But she's sloppy now. We can use that. I knew what he meant. When manipulators lose the rhythm of control, they overreach. They make noise. And noise leaves evidence. Patricia arrived an hour later with a flash drive and a grim expression. She's talking to someone named Reed Thorne, she said. Private wealth advisor out of Bozeman. Used to work with Kyle. Guess what company just filed a new LLC with his name attached? She handed me a document, Thorne Interiors and Design, LLC. Registered 2 days ago. Managing partners, Victoria Morrison and Kyle Brennan. My chest tightened. Not from surprise, from recognition. I knew that name. Thorne. It was my grandfather's middle name. She'd used my family's name to launch her betrayal. Patricia went on, they're setting up accounts in Wyoming. Holding company structure, layered ownership. She's laundering your assets into this shell. I looked at the paper again, my pulse steady. Cold. Controlled. She's not just trying to steal what I built, I said quietly. She's trying to erase me from it. Patricia nodded. Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting. She plugged the flash drive into my laptop and opened a series of screenshots. Email chains. Draft contracts. A memo. At the top of one document was a familiar header, Morrison Construction Group, confidential bid proposal. Only the metadata told a different story. Created by Kyle Brennan. Modified by Victoria Morrison. Jesus, I muttered. She used our bid template. Patricia's mouth tightened. Down to the formatting. She's trying to duplicate your business model under a new name. She even copied your subcontractor lists. She thinks if she gets to your clients first, she can lock you out of future contracts. I leaned back in my chair. Every nerve in me went still. This wasn't just betrayal. It was theft. Identity theft. Legacy theft. And that's when something shifted inside me, not rage, not grief. Something colder. Sharper. Resolve. Can we prove this came from our server? I asked. Patricia smiled faintly. Already did. I traced the digital fingerprint. Kyle downloaded your internal files the day before you confronted him. He probably thought wiping his laptop after would cover it up. And it didn't. Not when your IT logs keep server-side backups. George, who had joined us halfway through, exhaled slowly. Then we've got her. Fraud, intellectual property theft, conspiracy to misappropriate company data. That's more than civil court territory, that's criminal. He looked at me. But you need to decide, Alan. Do we go for justice or exposure? What's the difference? Justice happens quietly, he said. We go through the courts, keep your reputation clean, freeze her accounts, seize the assets. Exposure means we go public, press, community, humiliation. But once that door opens, you can't close it. You'll win, but you'll be scorched too. The choice hung heavy. Both paths led to ruin. The question was whose. I walked to the window, staring out at the lake. The surface was still, dark as slate. She wanted me erased, I said softly. She wanted the world to believe she built everything. That I was just the man in the background, controlling, cruel, forgettable. George said nothing. He didn't need to. So no, I said finally. We don't burn it. Not yet. We bury her, Legally, quietly, permanently. I want her stripped of every resource before she even realizes she's lost them. Patricia smiled. Surgical. I like it. The following weeks were a study in precision. While Victoria paraded her new company in front of potential investors, George and Patricia worked behind the scenes, freezing accounts, filing injunctions, drafting affidavits. Every time she made a move, we were already there. She tried to transfer funds. Blocked. Tried to secure a business loan under the new LLC. Flagged. Tried to contact former clients. Cease and desist notices hit their inboxes within the hour. It was like watching a structure collapse from the inside, quietly, methodically, inevitable. But the moment that truly told me we were winning came late one evening. Patricia forwarded me a voicemail. Victoria's voice. Alan, this is ridiculous. You're making a mistake. We could have handled this privately. Don't do this to yourself. You think you're punishing me, but you're not. You're just proving me right, that you were always controlling. The tone was perfect, tremulous, manipulative, almost tender. The kind of voice she'd used 1,000 times before to pull me back from the edge of leaving. Only this time, it didn't work. I didn't feel guilt. Or nostalgia. Just clarity. For the first time in months, I understood something simple. She wasn't powerful anymore. She was performing. And the performance had lost its audience. A week later, George called from Helena. It's done, he said. The judge granted the emergency motion. Her accounts are frozen, the assets under review, and her business registration has been flagged pending investigation. I didn't speak for a moment. Is she fighting it? Oh, she's trying, George said, almost amused. Her attorney filed 3 objections in 48 hours. But without Kyle's testimony, and with the digital trail we have, they don't have a leg to stand on. What about Kyle? George hesitated. His disappeared. His phone's off. Patricia thinks he left the state. I stared out at the lake again, the reflection of the clouds fractured by the wind. He'd always been the weak link. She must have realized he'd fold, and when he did, she abandoned him. Predators eat their own when they're starving. That night, I took the folder with all her documents, the ones Patricia had given me, and placed them in the old steel fire pit by the dock. Every photo. Every printed text. Every receipt. The flames took quickly, curling the edges into ash. It wasn't mercy. It was closure. She'd built her empire out of lies and manipulation. I'd dismantled it with truth and patience. But as the last paper turned black, I realized something else. I hadn't won against her. I'd won away from her. And in that quiet, smoke-drenched air, I finally felt something close to peace. Because some wars aren't about revenge. They're about reclamation. And I'd just reclaimed my life. There's a rhythm to collapse. It doesn't happen all at once. It starts in whispers, in rumors, in the slow turning of faces that used to smile when they saw you. For weeks, the whispers around Billings grew louder. Victoria's business launch party was postponed. Her social media went dark. The friends who'd once gushed over her bravery stopped tagging her in photos. One by one, the invitations she sent out to investors were quietly declined. Patricia called it economic isolation. I called it poetic symmetry. Because that's exactly how she'd planned to destroy me, by making me look unstable, unreliable, untouchable. Now, she was living that same slow suffocation. Still, I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Revenge wasn't the goal. Finality was. George called one morning with a tone I hadn't heard in months, satisfaction. She's out of moves, he said. The judge upheld the injunction. The trust is protected, the assets are secure, and the forensic accountant traced every offshore transfer right back to Kyle's credentials. So it's over, I said. Not quite, George replied. Her attorney just filed a settlement offer. You'll want to see this. He sent the document to my email, 6 pages, every word dripping with desperation disguised as diplomacy. Victoria wanted to end the conflict amicably. She offered to drop all claims if I withdrew the criminal complaints. She proposed a one-time payment for marital restitution, as if the past year could be reduced to a line item. At the end, in bold, In the spirit of closure, I hope we can both move forward with dignity. I stared at that line for a long time. Dignity. The word she'd stripped from me piece by piece. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I drove to the courthouse in person. When I walked into the atrium, the same cold, polished light poured down from the skylights. I hadn't been there since the day of the hearing, the day she'd smiled across the aisle like a woman watching her own performance unfold. Only this time, the performance was mine. George met me by the elevator. He handed me a pen and the final affidavit. Once you sign this, the court proceeds with criminal referral to the county prosecutor. No turning back. I took the pen. My hand didn't shake. Are you sure? George asked quietly. I was sure the day I found out she used my family's name for her company, I said. This isn't vengeance, George. It's record keeping. He gave a small nod. Then let's make it official. When the ink dried, a strange stillness filled me, not triumph, not relief. Something quieter. Like a storm finally running out of rain. By the end of that week, everything unraveled for her publicly. The Billings Gazette published a quiet but devastating article. Local designer under investigation for fraudulent use of corporate data. No names at first, but everyone knew. By afternoon, they added them. Her sponsors dropped her. Her investors pulled out. The woman who'd once controlled every narrative suddenly couldn't control a single headline. She called me once after that. Unknown number. I let it ring. Then she texted. You won, Alan. Congratulations. No punctuation. No apology. Just exhaustion, the kind that comes when the mask finally breaks and the face beneath it doesn't know who it belongs to anymore. I didn't respond. Because in truth, there was no victory here, only balance. Weeks later, George called with the final news. Charges filed, he said. Wire fraud, misappropriation, conspiracy. She won't serve time if she cooperates, but she'll never work under her name again. And Kyle. His testifying. Plea deal. Looks like he's trying to save himself. Of course he was. Cowards always float to the surface when the water turns cold. That evening, I drove to the lake house. It was early winter now, the water a sheet of dull silver under the fading light. I walked out onto the dock, the same dock where my father used to sit at dusk, where Victoria once promised me forever. The wind was sharp, cutting through my coat. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called. I pulled a small envelope from my pocket, her last handwritten note, the one she'd left the morning she moved out. You'll thank me someday for freeing you. I stared at it, then dropped it into the water. It floated for a second before sinking beneath the surface. No fire this time. No spectacle. Just gravity doing what it does best, pulling things back to where they belong. As the light faded, I realized something simple and terrifying. I didn't hate her anymore. Hatred had burned itself out somewhere along the way, replaced by something harder to name, understanding, maybe. Or the hollow kind of compassion you feel when you see a ruin and remember what it used to be. She'd wanted power. I'd wanted peace. In the end, we both got what we built for ourselves. And standing there in the chill of evening, I finally understood what my father meant when he used to say, the foundation always tells the truth. Because no matter how beautiful a structure looks on the surface, if it's built on deceit, it will fall. And she had. The weeks after the fall were the quietest of my life. Not peaceful, quiet, like the air right after a demolition. Dust still settling, the echo of what once stood still vibrating in the distance. Billings moved on fast. Small towns always do. People love a scandal, but they love forgetting even more. Within a month, Victoria's name was whispered only in fragments, half-told stories at bar counters, speculation in beauty salons, curiosity disguised as gossip. But me. I wasn't interested in gossip. I was interested in rebuilding. Morrison Construction had taken hits during the divorce, but the foundation, ironically, was still strong. We lost 2 contracts during the chaos, but gained 3 new ones once the restraining order was lifted and the dust cleared. The local business community, it turned out, respected endurance. One afternoon, I met with our foreman, Randy, out at the new commercial site just outside of Bozeman. The smell of sawdust and wet concrete filled the air. "You holding up, boss?" he asked, handing me a coffee. "Better than I deserve to," I said with a half-smile. He nodded, glancing toward the skeletal frame of the new structure rising behind us. "You know, I always liked that about you. You don't quit when things go sideways. You just grab a hammer and start again." I didn't say it then, but that line stayed with me. Because it wasn't about construction, it was about life. But there were nights, even then, when the silence in my house felt too big. The echoes of what used to be a marriage clung to the corners, the scent of her old perfume still faint in the guest room, her handwriting on the edge of an old grocery list. You don't live with someone for 23 years and walk away untouched. You just learn to carry the weight differently. Some nights I'd sit out on the porch with a glass of whiskey and think about how betrayal changes you, not just how you see people, but how you see yourself. I used to think I was a good judge of character. Careful. Grounded. But I'd missed the signs that were right in front of me, blinded by loyalty I mistook for love. Patricia once told me that betrayal has stages: shock, anger, obsession, then clarity. I didn't believe her back then. But clarity did come, slow and steady, like dawn over the lake. I wasn't a victim. I'd been careless. Too trusting. Too eager to believe that loyalty worked both ways. That realization hurt more than any lie she told. One morning, months later, I got a letter. No return address, but I knew the handwriting instantly. Victoria. Inside, a single page. I thought I could live with what I did. I can't. You were the only person who ever believed in me without asking for anything in return. I broke that. I see it now. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know. I was wrong about what mattered. No signature. Just that. I sat there for a long time, reading it over and over. Then I folded it neatly, put it in a drawer, and closed it. Because forgiveness wasn't the point. Understanding was. When spring came, I returned to the lake house for the first time since everything ended. The snow had melted, the pines stood dark against the pale water, and the dock creaked under my boots like it always had. I sat down on the same wooden planks my grandfather built and watched the reflection of the sky ripple on the surface. For the first time in a long while, I didn't think about Victoria. I thought about legacy. About my father. About the way he taught me that men don't build things for applause, they build them so they last. That's when I realized my revenge wasn't about taking anything back. It was about preserving what couldn't be taken. Integrity. Honor. The name my family had built over 3 generations. Victoria and Kyle had tried to rewrite my story. I'd simply refused to hand them the pen. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, I opened the ledger I kept for personal projects. On the first clean page, I wrote 6 words. The house stands. The storm passed. It wasn't a declaration of victory. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's endurance. Because in a world full of takers, the man who refuses to be broken is the one who wins quietly. And that's what I became. Quiet. Unbroken. Still building. Time didn't heal, it rebuilt. It didn't erase the cracks, it filled them with something tougher. By the 2nd year after the trial, my life had settled into a rhythm again. Work, travel, sleep. Quiet mornings, long drives, fewer calls. People in town still nodded when they saw me, some with pity, some with respect. The pity faded first. Respect stayed. George had retired by then, moved to Santa Fe. Before he left, he sent me a single message. You did what most men can't, Alan. You outlasted the story they tried to write for you. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because he was right. But the truth is, the story wasn't over, not really. Because one morning, 2 years later, a name resurfaced. KA Design Collective, out of Denver. A new luxury interiors brand with familiar motifs, minimalist gold logos, glass-heavy showrooms, even the same tagline Victoria once obsessed over, refined beginnings. I recognized it instantly. And beneath the business registration, there it was, Kyle Anderson. He'd resurfaced. Alone, this time. Or so he claimed. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. But curiosity, it's a stubborn thing. So I called Patricia. She sighed when she picked up. You've seen it too. Yeah, I said. You think she's involved? There was a pause. Legally, no. But designs that similar don't appear by coincidence. She's somewhere behind it. Quietly. Of course she was. Victoria never knew how to disappear. Only how to change masks. Patricia continued, do you want me to send a letter? We can make some noise. I thought about it for a long moment before answering. No, I said finally. Let them build. Let's see what the foundation's made of this time. And that was the end of it, for now. Months passed. KA design gained traction online. Influencers, glossy magazines, the same empty praise recycled under new names. Then, like clockwork, the cracks appeared. Suppliers unpaid. Lawsuits over breach of contract. A leaked email thread where Kyle insulted investors. The internet devoured them in days. And somewhere, I imagined her, watching from a rented apartment, phone in hand, realizing it was happening again. Not because of me. Because of who she'd always been. That night, I sat in my study, the same one that once held court documents and financial ledgers. Now it was quiet again. Books, old blueprints, a framed photograph of my father standing in front of our first family project. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Not triumph, peace. Because I understood now, I didn't destroy Victoria. I didn't have to. People like her build their own traps. You just have to step aside and let gravity do its work. In early spring, I started a scholarship in my father's name. The Morrison Foundation for Ethical Design and Construction. Small, local, but real. We funded 2 students from low-income families each year, kids who reminded me of myself before all of this. Before betrayal became part of my vocabulary. At the opening ceremony, one of the students, a quiet girl named Elise, asked me a question that stopped me cold. Mr. Morrison, she said, what made you start this? I looked at her, thought of everything I'd lost, everything I'd kept, and said, because building something honest matters more than finishing first. She nodded, and in her eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in years, faith. The kind that isn't naive. The kind that's earned. That night, as I locked up the office, I passed the old framed motto that hung by the door. My father's words, carved into oak. Measure twice. Build once. Break never. For years, I thought he meant it about construction. Now, I knew better. It was about people. About endurance. About the quiet, steady revenge of surviving well. And as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I realized. I didn't need the story to end. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't living in the wreckage. I was living in what came after. And that's where the real victory was. It happened on a Thursday. Late afternoon, the kind of light that turns the sky into brass and the streets into memory. I was in Bozeman for a regional construction summit, one of those events where people talk about sustainability and community partnership over catered lunches. I'd given a short speech about rebuilding ethics in local business, something I'd never imagined myself doing years ago. Afterward, I slipped out early, walking through the hotel lobby toward the exit. That's when I heard her voice. Soft. Familiar. A tone I hadn't heard in nearly 5 years. Alan. I turned. There she was. Victoria. Not the version I'd kept in my head, the one framed in betrayal and sharpness, but a smaller, quieter figure. Her hair shorter, streaked with silver. No heels, no posture of control. Just a woman holding a paper cup of coffee, wearing a coat too large for her frame. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of the lobby faded until all I could hear was the sound of my own pulse. Then she smiled. Not the kind of smile that sells something. The kind that surrenders. I wasn't sure you'd recognize me, she said. I almost didn't, I replied. But then again, ghosts tend to linger. That earned a faint laugh. The kind that catches halfway between regret and relief. I'm not here to stir anything, she said quickly. I just saw your name on the program. I wanted to hear you speak. You were good. I nodded once. You always did have an eye for presentation. She took the jab gracefully. Fair. Silence again. People brushed past us, their lives moving forward while ours lingered in the residue of what used to be. Finally, she spoke. I've been working with a small firm in Missoula. Interior projects. Nothing big. Under your name? I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. I figured, if I'm going to fail again, I'd rather do it honestly this time. There was something in her voice, thin but real. Not performance. Not pity. Something I hadn't heard since before everything fell apart. You look well, she said. So do you. It wasn't true. She looked fragile, older, like the years had been heavier for her than for me. But maybe that's what honesty looked like when it finally arrived, raw and imperfect. Before she turned to leave, she said one last thing. I read about your foundation. Your father would have been proud. That stopped me. Because no matter how deep the damage, some truth still landed. Maybe, I said softly. Or maybe he'd just tell me I finally learned how to build something that lasts. She smiled again, faintly. Then I guess you did what I never could. And with that, she walked away. No dramatic exit. No final apology. Just footsteps fading into the hum of strangers. I stood there for a long time, watching her disappear into the crowd. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger, or bitterness, or even vindication. Just understanding. We were both architects of our own ruin. The only difference was what we decided to build from the wreckage. She chose escape. I chose endurance. And endurance, quiet, steady, unglamorous, was what won in the end. That night, I drove back to the lake house. The air was still, the surface of the water like glass. I sat on the dock, listening to the small waves tap against the wood, the moon cutting a path across the water. In the reflection, I saw two lives, one that ended, one that continued. And somewhere between them, I finally felt the last piece of weight lift. Because forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about her. It was about giving myself permission to stop looking backward. To stop measuring my life by what broke it. To finally, let it be over. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and rain. I took a slow breath and whispered to the water, not as a curse, not as a memory, but as a benediction. It's done. And this time, I meant it. Fade out.